Daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye at my grandson's 7th birthday party and said, "You need to stop inserting yourself into our lives." Not quietly, not privately, right there in the backyard in front of the little folding table with the SpongeBob cake, while my grandson was 3 feet away trying to get a straw into his juice box. I didn't say a word. I smiled, set down the paper plate I was holding, and walked to my car. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the dashboard. Then I drove home, made myself a cup of coffee, and called my attorney. That was the beginning. But to understand why I did what I did next, you need to understand where we started, and how far things had fallen by the time she said those words to me. My son, let's call him my son-in-law's opposite in every way, because that's what he used to be. He was the child who called me on his lunch break just to check in. The one who drove 40 minutes each way to help me move a couch when my back was acting up. After his father passed, he was the one who sat with me at the kitchen table every Sunday for almost a year. Not because I asked him to, but because he knew I needed it. His name is Colin. He's 43 now. And the man I raised is still in there somewhere. I have to believe that. He met Renata when he was 38. She was 32, sharp, pretty, and very certain about what she wanted. I didn't have a bad feeling about her, not at first. She was polite at dinners. She laughed at the right moments. She asked me questions about my work. I'd spent 22 years as a hospital administrator before I retired, and she seemed genuinely interested. The first time something felt off was at Thanksgiving, about 8 months after they started dating. I'd offered to host. I always host. My house is big enough and I genuinely love cooking for people. It's how I show love, always has been. But Renata called Colin the week before and suggested they do it at her parents' place in Scottsdale instead. He called me to let me know, and when I said I'd already bought the turkey, there was this long pause on the line. "I know, Mom," he said. "I'm sorry. Her family is just, they really want us there." I said of course. I put the turkey in the freezer and spent Thanksgiving alone that year watching the parade and eating reheated soup. I told myself it was fine. Her parents hadn't had him for a holiday yet. It made sense. But it was the first brick. They got married the following spring. Small ceremony which I respected. I paid for the rehearsal dinner, around $6,000 because Colin asked me to and because I wanted to. I also gave them $20,000 as a wedding gift, which I had set aside from my retirement savings specifically for that purpose. I told them to use it however they needed. Down payment, emergency fund, whatever made sense. Within 6 months, that money was gone. I don't know exactly where it went. Renata had started a small online boutique, and I assumed some of it went there. I didn't ask. It was a gift. You give a gift and you let go. Their first son was born 14 months after the wedding. I cried in the hospital parking lot before I even walked in. I was a grandmother. Whatever had been complicated between me and Renata faded completely the moment that baby was placed in my arms. He had Colin's ears and the most serious expression I've ever seen on a newborn, like he was already thinking through a difficult problem. They named him Oliver. I became the kind of grandmother I'd always hoped to be. I was there every Tuesday. I brought dinners. I took Oliver to the park. I was the one he ran to when he got his first real scrape on his knee and needed someone to make it better. By the time their second son was born, Leo, 2.5 years later, I was part of the rhythm of that household. And then, slowly, I wasn't. I can't point to the exact moment Renata decided I was a problem. Maybe there wasn't one moment. Maybe it built up the way these things do. A comment I made that landed wrong. A decision where she felt undermined. Some version of me she decided she didn't want around. But the Tuesdays started getting cancelled. A scheduling conflict. Then a doctor's appointment. Then, the boys are coming down with something. Weeks would pass. When I did come over, there was a new quality to Renata's presence in the room. A watchfulness. She would hover near the boys when I was with them, not obviously but consistently. If I picked Leo up, she'd appear in the doorway. If Oliver and I started playing a game, she'd find a reason to redirect him to something else within 10 minutes. I tried talking to Colin about it. He listened and then he said what I suspect Renata had coached him to say. "Mom, she just has her own way of doing things. You have to respect that." I did respect it. I went out of my way to ask before offering opinions, to check before making plans, to make myself small enough that she couldn't find fault with me. It didn't matter. The birthday party comment happened on a Saturday in October. Oliver was turning 7. I had been invited, technically, though the invitation came as a text from Renata that said parties at 2, with no other information. No address, as if I might have forgotten where my son lived. I showed up with a wrapped gift and a balloon. I was standing near the back fence, talking to Colin's college roommate, when Renata walked up to me with the specific energy of someone who has been working up to a conversation for a while. "I need to say something," she said. The roommate excused himself. "You make everything about you," she said. "Every time you're here, the boys are focused on you and it throws off our whole routine. Colin and I have talked about this and we agree. You need to stop inserting yourself into our lives." I looked at her. Oliver was right there, 3 feet away, struggling with that juice box. I said nothing. I picked up my paper plate, set it down, and walked to my car. On the drive home, I went through the full range. Hurt first, then anger, then something that felt almost like clarity. Because here's the thing about being 64 and having spent 2 decades managing a hospital with 600 employees and a budget larger than most people will see in their lifetimes, I have learned how to be still in the face of something that needs to be handled carefully. I thought about the custodial accounts. 3 years earlier, when Oliver was 4, I had set up UTMA accounts for both boys. Uniform transfers to Minors Act accounts, one for each of them. I'd funded them myself, transferring a portion of my savings over time. By that October, Oliver's account had a little over $42,000 in it. Leo's had just under $31,000. The money was invested conservatively, index funds, mostly, some bond allocations, and it was intended to be there for them when they turned 21. College, a down payment, whatever they needed. I was the custodian, my name, my setup. My attorney had handled the paperwork. Renata did not know the exact figures. She knew the accounts existed. I'd mentioned them to Colin shortly after I set them up, but I had not discussed the amounts with either of them, and Colin, to his credit, had never pushed me on it. 2 weeks after the birthday party, Colin called me. "Mom," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that I recognized from when he was a teenager, about to ask for something he already knew I might say no to. "Renata and I have been talking. We're thinking of refinancing the house, and we were wondering if there was any way to access the boys' accounts to help with the closing costs." I sat down at my kitchen table. "The accounts are in their names," I said. "They're UTMA accounts. The money is for them." "Right, but you're the custodian. You control them until the boys are old enough." "That's not how a custodian works," I said carefully. "A custodian's obligation is to manage the funds for the benefit of the minor. I can't use that money for a refinance." Another pause. "Renata talked to someone at the bank," he said. "She thinks there might be flexibility." The sentence set in my chest like a stone. I told him I'd think about it. I hung up and called my attorney within the hour. He confirmed what I already knew. Renata had gone to our local branch and asked a teller, not a trust officer, a teller, whether the custodian could withdraw funds for a family expense. The teller had apparently said something vague and non-committal, which Renata had interpreted as a green light. My attorney's advice was straightforward. I couldn't legally prevent Renata or Colin from making inquiries, but I could move the accounts to a more restricted custodial structure through a trust company that would require documented justification for any distribution outside standard educational expenses. He laid out the process. It would take about 2 weeks. In the meantime, he recommended I send a formal letter to my current brokerage specifying that no request for distribution should be honored without written instruction from me, reviewed by counsel. I sent the letter. I moved the accounts. I did not tell Colin, not because I was trying to hide something. Everything I did was completely legal, and it was my right as custodian, but because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I had that conversation. What I was dealing with became clearer about 10 days later, when Colin showed up at my front door on a Tuesday evening without calling first. I hadn't had a Tuesday at their house in months. The irony wasn't lost on me. He looked tired. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd made coffee the morning after the birthday party, the same table where we'd sat every Sunday after his father died, And he said Renata tried to request a distribution from Oliver's account. The brokerage said there was a new protocol and all requests had to go through a trust officer. I know, I said. He looked at me. She tried to access the account without telling me first, I said. Colin, she went to the bank and asked about accessing money that I set up for your children, without mentioning it to me, after the birthday party, after asking me to remove myself from your lives. I watched him work through that. She said she was just asking questions, he said, but his voice had changed. A request for a distribution is not just a question, I said, and if you want me to remove myself from your lives, that's something we can discuss. But I will not allow that money to be used for anything other than what it's intended for. That is not negotiable. It was never negotiable. I don't think you actually knew it was being pursued this way. The silence in that kitchen lasted a long time. Finally, he said, she told me you'd agreed in principle. I hadn't said a single word that could have been interpreted that way. I want to be honest about what the next few months were like, because it wasn't clean. It wasn't a moment where everything snapped into place and the wrongness was obvious to everyone. Colin didn't walk out of my kitchen and go home and confront Renata and have some dramatic revelation. Real life doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. What happened was slower, harder, more human. Colin started coming by on his own, not every week, but regularly. Sometimes he'd call first, sometimes he'd just appear on my porch with a coffee from the place on the corner. We talked about a lot of things that we hadn't talked about in years. His job, the financial pressure they'd been under since Renata's boutique had struggled, how he felt like he'd been managing two households, his own and mine, emotionally, and how that had quietly broken something in him. I listened more than I talked. That was new for me. I'm not naturally a listener. I'm a fixer. A manager, a person who sees the problem and reaches for the solution before the other person has finished describing it. But I had spent 6 months making myself small and it hadn't worked, so I tried something different. About 3 months after the kitchen conversation, Colin told me that he had started seeing a therapist. He mentioned it in passing, like it was a minor logistical update. I said I thought that was a really good idea, and I meant it completely. Another month after that, he told me that he and Renata were in couples counseling. I didn't ask questions. I just said I was glad. The first time I saw Oliver and Leo after the birthday party was at Christmas. Colin called me 2 weeks before and asked if I wanted to come over. Just come over. No occasion, no party, no curated event. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Renata was cordial. Not warm, not apologetic, but civil in the careful way of someone who has been told by a therapist that they need to try. Oliver ran at me full speed from the living room and nearly knocked me over. Leo, who was more cautious by nature, stood back for about 30 seconds and then held out his arms to be picked up. I held him and breathed. I didn't bring up the accounts. I didn't bring up the birthday party. I brought a pan of the green bean casserole that Colin has requested every Christmas since he was 8 years old. And I sat at their table, and I watched my grandsons argue about whose turn it was, with the remote control, and it felt, tentatively, like something. I'm going to tell you where things stand now, because I think you deserve the actual ending and not a tidy version of it. The accounts are still structured the way I restructured them. Oliver is 9 now. Leo is 6.5. The money is still there, still growing, still designated for them. Colin and I have had a direct conversation about it. A real one, not the one he was sent to have with me, but one where we both said what we actually thought. He understands now what a custodial account is and isn't. He understands what I was protecting and why. Renata and I are not close. I don't expect we will be. But she no longer treats my presence in her house like an intrusion to be managed. I don't know if that's the therapy or the realization that I wasn't going away or something else entirely. I've stopped trying to figure out her interior life. I focus on what I can see. My son is present in a way he wasn't for several years. My grandsons know my voice and my laugh and the way I make scrambled eggs on slow Saturday mornings when they stay over. They stayed over last month for the first time in 2 years. We watched a movie and ate too much popcorn, and Oliver fell asleep on my shoulder before the ending. There was a moment, around midnight after they'd gone to bed and I was sitting in the quiet of my living room, where I thought about that birthday party. about standing at the back fence with the paper plate, about driving home and sitting in the parking lot of my own house, watching the clock. I had made one phone call. I had moved 2 accounts. I had said almost nothing. And somehow, in all of that quiet, I had managed to hold on to what mattered most. Not the money. The money was never the point. The money was just the place where the truth became visible, where what someone said they valued and what they actually reached for turned out to be two different things. The point was Oliver falling asleep on my shoulder. The point was Leo holding out his arms. Some things are worth protecting in silence. Some fights don't need to be loud to be won. I'm 64 years old, and I have buried a husband and raised a son and managed a hospital for 2 decades, and the most important thing I know is this: when someone shows you who they are, believe them, and then decide very carefully what you're going to do about it. I decided quietly, and I'd make the same choice again. I still think about that October afternoon sometimes, the SpongeBob cake, the juice box, the way Renata's voice was so even and controlled, like she'd practiced it in the car on the way over. What I've come to understand, not right away but slowly, the way most real things arrive, is that what happened between us wasn't really about the accounts. It wasn't about Tuesdays or birthday parties or who got to hold Leo first. It was about something older and simpler than any of that. It was about what we actually believe is ours to protect, and whether we're willing to act on that belief when it costs us something. I made choices in those months that weren't comfortable. Moving the accounts felt clinical and cold when I was doing it. Sitting across from Colin in my kitchen and saying out loud that his wife had misrepresented something to him, that was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Because I knew that no matter how carefully I said it, some part of him was going to have to choose what to do with it. I couldn't make that choice for him. A mother can't. Eventually. That's not weakness, that's just the truth of it. What I kept coming back to was this: doing the right thing doesn't always look righteous in the moment. Sometimes it looks quiet. Sometimes it looks like walking to your car and sitting alone for 11 minutes. The integrity of an action isn't measured by how it appears to the people watching. It's measured by whether you could explain it fully, in daylight, to anyone who asked. I could explain everything I did, every phone call, every legal step, every word I chose and word I held back. That matters to me. It has always mattered to me. There's a kind of wisdom, I think, that only comes from having lived long enough to know the difference between a battle worth fighting loudly and one worth winning quietly. I spent 22 years in hospital administration making hard calls under pressure, and the lesson that outlasted everything else was this: the clearest thinking happens when the emotion is real, but the response is measured. Renata pushed. I felt it. And then I thought, that sequence, feel, then think, then act, is not something that comes naturally. It has to be practiced. It has to be chosen, over and over, in situations far smaller than this one, until it becomes the way you move through the world. And then there's the matter of staying in it, not giving up, not deciding that because something is hard and slow and uncertain, it isn't worth continuing. Colin and I have something now that we didn't have 2 years ago, an honesty between us that had gone soft from disuse. That didn't happen because I walked away. It happened because I stayed present and patient and refused to let the distance become permanent, even when every easy instinct said to just let go. Oliver fell asleep on my shoulder last month. I keep returning to that, not because it's a triumph or a proof of anything, but because it's the thing I was protecting all along. Not the money, not my pride, not even my place in their lives. Just that. A 7-year-old who trusts me enough to fall asleep. That's what it was all for, and I'd do it again without a second thought.